to today's webinar, Love Your Sourcing Strategy by Letting It Go. That's going to be our topic for today. And before I introduce my co-presenter and more about the topic, just a couple of housekeeping notes. We're using the WebEx platform here, and we encourage you to enter any questions you may have into the chat box as we proceed through the presentation today, and we'll be happy to address as many of those questions as possible. We'll address those questions. My name is Richard Wall. I'm Zycus's Vice President of Corporate Development, and I'm pleased to be joined today by my co-presenter, Kelly Barner. And she is the owner and managing director of Buyers Meeting Point. Let me tell you a little bit about her bio. She has a unique perspective on procurement from the numerous roles she's held during a 15-year career in procurement. The last 7 or so years, she's covered procurement news, events, publications, solutions, trends, and relevant economics at Buyers Meeting Point. Now, this Meeting Point provides the procurement industry with an events calendar, blog, active social media network, and podcast, all trusted sources of information for practitioners and solution providers alike. Kelly also has several regular columns through industry. In the summer of 2016, she was appointed to become the Business Survey Chair for the ASM New York Report Business. Kelly has her MBA from Babson College, as well as an MS in Library and Information Science from Simmons College. Co-authored 3 books: Supply Market Intelligence for Procurement Professionals, Research, Process, and Resources, published in 2014. Procurement at Crossroads, Career Impacting Insights into a Rapidly Changing Industry, published in 2016. And in 2017, published Finance Unleashed, Leveraging the CFO for Innovation. So lots of great experience and content. And Kelly, let me invite you to get us started on this journey towards loving our sourcing strategies by letting them go.
I'm glad to do that. Thank you so much for the introduction, Richard. I'm very pleased to be here today based on what I have seen, should be both an interesting and to a certain extent entertaining webinar on some of the very real challenges that procurement is facing today. One of the thoughts that I had in preparing to take on this topic, the idea that for so long, at least when you look out into the enterprise, procurement has almost become recognized one for one with 2 things. Our processes, mostly strategic sourcing, is what people in the rest of the company know us for, and secondly, our technology. And yet, that dates back almost 2 decades for a lot of companies. And as time has progressed forward, there's a lot of evolution. Procurement has evolved as a pool of talent, but it has also evolved as a function. And our processes have shifted in response to the different kinds of categories of spend that we manage. And as our technology has progressed light years beyond where it started in the very earliest days of analysis and very basic effects, it also changed how we interact with our colleagues in the enterprise. And the fact of the matter is, there's potential now for procurement to be so much bigger. If I could actually have you back that slide up, I'm going to stay with my very shadow ghost. Thank you. Have changed so much, and the people that we work with have changed so much. And in order for us to continue that evolution, I'm presenting the theory that the time has come for us to let go. So many of the challenges that we have today, even in terms of wanting to either reach the C-suite or increase the influence that we have there, wanting to take on some of the sacred cow categories of spend that we've not been invited to approach in the past, or just get into more strategic, less traditional procurement type projects. In order to be invited or given the opportunity to do those things, we need to let go our process and we need to let go our technology. That don't mean we need to stop using either one of those things, but we need to allow them to be both a foundation for the work that we do and also sort of our emissaries out into the enterprise. There's fantastic technical functionality that is very user-friendly and is intended for every single distributed and buyer in the enterprise to be able to use with minimal training and maximum convenience. But in order for them to leverage the benefits of that, we have to use what it's fully capable of. And that's a scary thing. So part of what I talk about today is why procurement feels fear or anxiety about some of these things. And some of what we're going to talk about is how to change that, right, in order to be as productive as we possibly can. But the big thing that we need to keep in mind is that the evolution or change, depending on what you're looking at, it is inevitable and is unstoppable. And so our challenge today, both in the next hour and also in general as a function, is have the healthiest possible response we can to this inevitable change and evolution to maximize benefit to the enterprise and also maximize the growth and continued evolution of procurement. So now we can go ahead and jump to that next slide. And sort of broken out two different perspectives on fear here. So I'm not a big scary movie person. I'm sort of the one that even when you're watching the previews in the commercial and a person hears the sound and they grab the baseball bat or the umbrella or whatever it is and they creep up into the attic to find out what the sound was, I'm the person going, yeah, I would grab my cell phone and I would be down the street, not up in the attic investigating the sound. So we all have different responses to fear. In fact, a motivator. What gets you up to go investigate, or when you have more of a flight response like me and you take off out of the interest of self-preservation, it has either a positive or negative response. A few people are faced with fear and kind of shrug their shoulders and do nothing. On the left-hand side here, I actually had the healthy side of fear response. Hormesis, believe it or not, this is sort of a real scientific cap of the idea that, you know, Nietzsche, that which does not kill you makes you stronger, that by being exposed to things that make us anxious or uncomfortable or nervous in manageable doses over time actually make us stronger. So it's a little bit like the idea of getting a vaccine, right? A flu vaccine is not a magical cure for the flu. It's a manageable dose of the flu. It teaches your body how to fight the actual flu or minimize its effects should you actually be exposed to the virus. So a healthy response to fear or anxiety about letting different parts of procurement and sourcing strategy go. What responses might you have? If you're nervous, it may cause you to invest in better advanced planning, saying, okay, we're going to expose this new functionality, or we're going to roll this out to a different business unit or part of the organization. Let's do some extra planning, right? It might also, especially if you're presented with a very specific challenge, not just sort of amorphous fear, it creates a willingness to consider less conventional options to solve problems. So even if you haven't tried things in the past, you might, okay, well, this is a case where we should try something different because we're facing a new challenge. We're facing something that's creating uncertainty or is making us anxious. You will be more perceptive to signs of trouble. This is something that I always caution. I have young kids, and if it's the day before a vacation, I'm the one that's constantly saying, nope, today is the day to pay extra attention. We're all anxious, we're all a little on edge, we're heading to the airport or heading in the car for a long trip. Pay more attention to where you put your shoes. Pay more attention to where you put your cell phone charger. Give a little extra thought, because today is not the day to make a silly mistake. I think the same dynamic can exist in terms of our response to fear. So you're going to listen a little bit more closely to influencers within the enterprise. If in a somewhat anxious situation, a stakeholder calls you up and voices an opinion, you might sort of like, oh yeah, so-and-so is always complaining. No, not in these circumstances. If you have an elevated sense of awareness, you're going to take every single input more seriously. And finally, I think this is the big one. You're going to be more open to soliciting and accepting help from others. You can't go it alone. There's safety in numbers, even in response to amorphous fear. So these are some of the healthy things that shake us completely back away from a world that makes us nervous. On the other end of the spectrum, we have absolute most negative response to fear or anxiety creating conditions. So there's a piece in the brain, and this is important because it's where we're hard-coded. I think it's where we need to pay the most attention. The amygdala is the piece of your brain that says, okay, I'm feeling fear, and it goes back to, kid drawings. It's a saber-toothed tiger, time to go. We need to preserve the species. We need to preserve the tribe. Some of that's still in there. And because it's very primitive, it's also very powerful. Sometimes we end up responding to fear as a motivator without consciously saying, I'm up and run, right? As scary as things happening within procurement in the face of change can be, little of it actually threatens our survival. So you're not going to see people, running around or absolutely physically panicking, but it causes us to maybe snap to judgment, maybe say no too quickly or shut down an idea, actually would have been very beneficial. It diminishes our ability to handle decision-making and relationship building. So if you're frozen in fear, you're not going to have the ability to say, okay, the wheels are coming off the bus. We need to do something to control our situation. Let's prioritize efforts. Let's figure out where the biggest risk is and address that first. And it's to a certain extent going to alienate further the people that we actually need to work with better in order to maximize our results. So we get defensive. We say, no. Such uncertainty, now's not the time to try something new, right? And we're also distrustful to others' offers of help because we actually see that as creating more uncertainty when we already have more than we feel like we can comfortably handle. We've gone through some healthy and unhealthy approaches to fear. And the next one I want to give just a little bit more context. We've talked about this idea of decentralized procurement. So all of the discussions of fear, both I talk about the fear, its source, healthy and unhealthy responses to it, and also Richard's data and real-life examples and case studies, back to this idea of upside. What are, in fact, the advantages of being able to decentralize procurement? What I'm not talking about here is taking direct members of the procurement team and embedding them in the enterprise. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking specifically about for people to make use of e-procurement and things like fully integrated Amazon buyer, just as an example. Distributed use of preferred supplier lists so that under certain circumstances, you don't have to go through a full strategic sourcing process. Maybe, depending on your organization, you consider self-sourcing under right circumstances and with appropriate controls and governance. At the end of the day, if we can decentralize the effort and the information, that's ultimately what's going to make procurement more scalable from a principle standpoint, right? It's about focusing on effective spend management in the enterprise as a whole, as opposed to, nope, if there wasn't a procurement person in the room when you hit that button, we can't be certain you did the right thing. Now, about scaling procurement and empowering people to make sure that they get what they need on the right kind of schedule, but so that we also position as we let the process and the technology go out into the enterprise, then frees us up to take on some of these different kinds of strategic opportunities. So look at breaking our fears apart. And this is just sort of an outline, next slide here, about what we're going to go through over the next 45 minutes. So I've broken four what I see as very common types of procurement fear. For each one of them, we're going to talk about the source of the fear. So this gets back to sort of the primitive. Where does this come from? Because it's all logical. The first thing is recognize and accept the fear. The one is let's look at those binary responses. What's the most positive response we can have to this fear? What's the most negative response we could have to this fear? And what's the end goal in each one of these areas? So if each one of these fears is on an evolutionary journey, what's the end point that we're working towards right now? And as I go through the four fears, Richard is going to, he and I will jump back and forth. He's got some great case examples and some fantastic data. So he'll also add that in to illustrate real-life examples of what I am talking about with these fears. So fear, loss savings. I don't know how many of you listening in have ever studied Maslow's hierarchy. It's something where he outlined what are the basic human needs. If you could move the slide. He talks about, the very basic. Humans need food, we need some sort of basic clothing, and we need basic shelter. And from there, it gradually moves up, sort of like through, organized formal society. You get to layer on top of that. And some right near the top of the pyramid is nice cars and fancy vacations. But the very basic is and shelter. And for procurement, that is savings. The source of our fear of losing out on savings or having leakage is the fact that this is, in most organizations, why we were created. We were created as a formal strategic function in order to deliver savings. Now, we'll talk about the fear of maybe having less savings. A positive response to that fear is to increase communication. So you go into the enterprise and you say, okay, we're trying some different things. We're taking some different approaches. Make sure that as we go down this road, keep in how important savings is. Keep in mind hitting your budget. Keep in what the company has told shareholders about earnings expectations and what our goals are for the year. Increasing positive communication. A negative response, this is sort of unfortunately the classic procurement stereotype of where we get saddled with sort of the pen pincher idea. So a negative response is to hoard the pennies. If you feel the savings is slipping away, if you start to focus on savings to the exclusion of all other potential benefits, it's going to block out our relationships with other people, and it's going to undo any effort that we've made to empower other people in the organization. Now, the ultimate goal to overcoming this fear, and we're never going to get away from savings as a primary performance metric, but the advantage to overcoming this fear in terms of it preventing us from acting is that it will improve our relationships and how we're perceived in the organization, and opens the door to increased value creation. So it may indeed be a trade-off. In a lot of cases, if we were to trade off even 2% or 5% of savings, that's very scary to procurement because small percentages, but big numbers in terms of our results. What are you trading them for? There's the possibility that we can balance that savings versus value. And I think here, Richard is going to come in and talk a little bit about his own balance, right, procurement's mandate versus how resources are allocated. So, Rich, I'll hand it to you here.
Thanks, Kelly. And you certainly firmly established that these fears are real. So if they're real, they need to be dealt with. And wanted to try to share some various perspectives and strategies for overcoming the first one, in this case, fear of loss of savings. And gosh, if you were going to ascribe an acronym to it, and Lord, everything needs an acronym, this would be FLOSS, right? Fear of loss of savings. And I think the case I'd like to make is that the proper response is first to make sure that you're, number one, focusing on the highest value opportunities so that you're not foregoing those savings. And wherever possible, introduce automation to be able to optimize your efficiency on those opportunities that you've chosen to focus on. And ultimately, there's a strategy, and it gets back to our title and theme here about loving your sourcing strategy by letting it go, that involves really identifying some of the lower value, in some cases tail spend kind of opportunities, and saying we need to let that go. That's where we need to focus on as sourcing professionals. Let the end users manage that. So to start building this case, I thought we first start looking at sort of what does the data tell us about where sourcing FTEs, full-time equivalents, are spending their time today. So this is some Hackett Group data. I think it's revealing, and I guess I'd start with what I would consider the good news first, is that the majority of sourcing professionals, full-time equivalents, are spending most of their time, 70%, on the medium to high complexity sourcing events that also represent, the lion's share of corporate spending. So they are focused on the bigger ticket items, if you will. The bad news, if you will, while we're allocating 70% of resource time, medium to high complexity categories, those that are medium being $250K to $1 million in annual expenditure, and high being $1 million and above, those taken together actually comprise a higher percentage, 84% of total spend. So, if I looked at the glass is half empty side of the equation here, I would say, well, we ought to be allocating more than 70%. It ought to be 84% or more, such that it's proportionate to the amount of spend. But at least, as I said, the good news is the majority of the sourcing professional resource, those FTEs, are focused on those medium, higher complexity projects that, as we see on the right here, also take a longer time. So the cycle time for a tactical or low complexity, defined as a category with annual spend below $250K, that's just about 5 days on average. But when we get into the medium to high, that's going to be somewhere between 40 to 65 days cycle time on average, and of course, in some cases, up to as many as 70 to 120 days. So one of the conclusions that I would draw initially here is that being able to introduce automation, especially around those medium to high complexity events, would allow the sourcing resource to spend more time on more higher value projects, therefore overcoming any potential loss of savings. So I thought next, as we move to the next slide, drill down a little bit more on the data, see where is the time actually consumed in these, on average, 40 to 65 day kind of sourcing cycles. And it's pretty revealing to see that actually half of the overall cycle time is consumed in this stage called evaluate and negotiation, where I'm, looking at supplier bid responses and determining the award. I'm simultaneously assessing potential supplier risks and proceeding post-negotiation event into the contract creation and negotiation to put those agreements in place. So that's 50% of the cycle time overall. Again, some good news here. I think these are the areas where the automation tools available, and of course Zycus is one of the leading players, not the only one, of course, that provides a suite of first-to-pay software tools, but it's these areas that automation can deliver maximum benefit to really shrink that overall cycle time and address, again, the component that represents the highest percentage of the overall time in the cycle. Let's look at what those benefits are of automation. On the next slide, just kind of breaks down for us the different categories: benefits of supplier discovery, software, spend analytics, e-sourcing, and contract lifecycle management, and how they address the overall efficiencies of that sourcing process. And, just a couple of the highlights. If we look at spend analytics, greater than 1/3 improvement in the time spent in this phase, in the amount spend that you're able to analyze, and the accuracy. E-sourcing, 30% overall cycle time reduction from automation. And when it comes to contract lifecycle management, you'll define contracts 50% faster and reduce last contracts about 40%, while simultaneously increasing the compliance to standard T's and C's in those contracts by about the same percentage. So I think that helps us make the case that number one, we want to focus on the highest value savings opportunities. Number two, find ways to automate wherever possible to increase the efficiency in that area. But if we go to the next slide, it isn't all about just technology. It's also about strategy. So here, really a best practice would really be to look at the sourcing as a portfolio management exercise. and recognize that not all spend categories, not all stakeholders are created equally, and really focus the attention on those where the highest returns possible. That starts with those categories that lend themselves to a global category strategy and global categorization. I know there's a lot of data crammed in on one slide here, but in the box in the center, it highlights the fact that where a global category strategy is implemented and is appropriate, the highest savings potential are realized, so 7.3% in the case of a global category strategy, and that would be on average about 40% of total spending. Next, look at those categories that lend themselves, not next slide, but next point, would be that the area is those strategies that lend themselves to a business unit specific or maybe a geographical or regional approach, which would represent about 25% of overall spending and yield about 6% savings, and then a local country sourcing strategy for about 10% of the overall spend, and progressively the savings potential becomes lower as we've identified more narrow or niche components of spend at the local country sourcing level. Now you're at 4%. But overall, this says that source professionals should be focused on this 5% of total spend that lends itself to some level of collaboration and a category strategy that's driven by procurement specifically. Now, that leaves us with 25% tactical sourcing and non-procurement managed spend, which of course delivers the lowest savings potential at just about 3.5%. These are opportunities to really let it go, to enable within a structured process that can still be compliant, service sourcing on behalf of end users or stakeholders in the business. And really the proposal here is that procurement doesn't need to involved in that kind of tail spend management that's not going to represent the maximum value and won't create this loss of savings because you're focusing your time and attention on the highest value opportunities. So a couple ways to do that. Number one, and now we can go to the next slide, the 75% of spending that is driven by the sourcing professional through a category strategy does lend itself to a standardized process such that I can effectively collaborate with my counterparts in different business units, different parts of the globe. We're going to follow a structure. You see 5 sort of steps here and a standard of a sourcing process methodology, and then the tools giving me the visibility at a project level to see what are the tasks assigned to the different collaborators and what is the status. So this is where I want to spend maximum amount of time and effort from a sourcing professional standpoint, because these are the more complex, longer cycle type of sourcing projects that I really need this type of rigor and discipline around. Now, next slide, and contrast that kind of structured, rigorous methodology with 3 bids and a buy. So this is that 25% of spend that procurement no longer really has to directly manage, especially if the technology can make sure that on a self-service basis, end users are still following a compliant process. And in this case, a tool like a source tool here that would enable an end user to execute that tactical 3 bid and a buy process that we said earlier was on average about a 5-day cycle time. But I don't have to be an expert to do it. I can create my RFQ on a single screen. I can invite new suppliers on the fly with just an email address, and I can very quickly obtain the 3 competitive quotes that I need, compare them side by side, forward the business, and off we go. And procurement didn't need to get involved at all, but not have to suffer that potential fear that savings were somehow lost, that a non-compliant maverick process was enabled, because the technology has allowed me to comfortably let go and enable and empower end users. So just some thoughts on that first area we want to tackle the fear of loss of savings, or floss, as I said?
Like you said, it's not real if we don't have an acronym for it. So I guess if it's harder, this works a little bit less well. But this is another core fear that procurement faces. And actually, I think, Richard, those last two slides that you had where you contrasted sort of the very rigid, these are chevrons and these are your sub-steps, with something that enforces, let's say, the spirit of the process, if not the absolute letter. Procurement initially was able to scale our impact because our process was repeatable. So anybody here worked for a company that one day did not have strategic procurement or strategic sourcing, depending on how it was labeled, and the big consulting firm came in and gave you some chevrons and bullet points and things, and then you did have it. That process was everything. I went through one of those transitions, and in my team of roughly 40 professionals, I don't think there was a cube or an office that did not have the official process flow hanging up so that it was actively visible at all times. It was maybe before we became sort of branded as our technology. Procurement was branded based on the process flow. And the fact that you could apply a logical process and standardized rigor to basically any category of spend and improve the value that was earned in return for the money, as with minimizing the risk associated with the contracts and supplier relationships, was a revolutionary thing. Like anything else, over time, things have a way of sort of getting away from their true intent. And I think strategic sourcing is a great example. You call something strategic if it's made with a cookie cutter, right? And somewhere along the way, the chevrons and the bullet-pointed sub-steps became less of a strategic guide and more a checkbox process flow. And procurement, we struggle because we understand, some of us better than others, the rationale behind needing to have all these steps. But every project is exactly the same. I can remember in those early days going through different conversations and training and people suggesting, well, step one should be, is the right thing, in fact, to strategically source this. And I'm thinking, okay, yeah, you always, as well as you know the process, as well as you know the intent, the objectives that you're working towards, you have to keep your intellect switched on to make those context-sensitive decisions. And handling a move away from such rigid standardization create another one of these challenges for procurement. So our positive response to this fear that if we let other people do some of the sourcing, obviously governed by standards and enabled by technology, oh, but you're going to do that the way we would. You're not going to approach this the same way we would. We need to be okay with that. The focus, however, becomes make sure that critical steps aren't skipped. So you would never want to have somebody say, okay, we need to do our 3 bids and a buy. Oh, we already have like 5 incumbent suppliers. We don't need it. In the end, we're only hoping to get 2 or 3. We need more than 5. Well, that's a mistake. Right? You've now capped the potential value of this project. You need to decide whether or not additional suppliers should be invited to compete. Same goes for providing suppliers feedback after the initial round of bids is received. Richard was talking about that 25% where the lowest savings comes in. That's because people don't take the time to read through the initial round of bids or proposals and say, this one guy had a really good idea. We'd like to see how all the rest of you would incorporate that. And no savings and value can be realized by taking that approach, just as much as you wouldn't want to skip negotiation. So the approach is led communication around savings. It's education around why all of these sub-steps and process flows exist in the first place. A negative response is to say, nope, marketing never brings in new suppliers, or marketing never negotiates, they never do additional feedback to suppliers, so they can't be trusted. We can't be flexible. They're skipping steps, those big step skippers, and we're just going to lock it down. With no flexibility, we need to reestablish control, and we roll in and we lock it back down. That's the most negative response. Letting go of the need for 100% mandated, consistent standardization is that maybe there's a non-standard response that will actually lead to better results. Maybe we shouldn't strategically source. Maybe where the market is, we look and say, you know what, we actually have a pretty good deal right now. And given the time it would take and the money it's going to cost and what it's going to require from our suppliers, maybe we'll just extend this contract a year. That's a valid approach, but someone needs to think about it. You have to step outside of the standardization. It allows us to build better partnerships with our suppliers. Nothing drives suppliers crazier when they feel like people are just going through the motions. It requires everyone's time, it requires everyone's effort and money and resource commitments. If you're just going through the process, it's such a waste. So many better things could be accomplished with that time. Then instead to say, okay, this is an opportunity to do something non-traditional, non-standard, take it as an opportunity to innovate. It really is about achieving a balance between the right level of creativity and right level of standardization, one project at a time. And Richard, I believe you're going to tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I did want to pick up on your point about this desire for ability to really exercise creativity. And I think there is this perception out there that there's massive threat to creativity in the form of tools like artificial intelligence or cognitive computing. You take whichever term you prefer. But I think there is a really good news story here as well, because I don't think that AI is out to, eliminate jobs or eliminate human judgment process. And I'll just draw you sort of scenario here of the way we see AI being propagated throughout the source-to-pay process, and really at every step of the way helping inform better decision-making rather than replace the human element in the process, so that, freeing up that experienced sourcing professional to maximize their creativity rather than stifling it. So if you look at kind of the traditional starting point of this cycle where you're formulating your sourcing strategies, first you're looking at spend data to interpret that data and see what it's telling you. And, in the spirit of just making sure that you are able to focus more of your attention on the highest value opportunities, tools like a spend miner that actually sifts through the spend data and uses, number one, artificial intelligence, first of all, to correctly categorize all this spend transaction, but importantly then interprets some of that data to suggest to me what the highest savings potential opportunities are, so that I don't waste a lot of time trying to gather data, interpret those results. I can get to work on the critical projects. And along the way, too, using artificial intelligence then as sort of my tickler file. So I don't have to remember that, I negotiated a contract with a volume rebate discount. Let the technology track that for me and give me an alert when approaching those rebate thresholds, for example, so that all happens on a looked-out basis. I don't have to be thinking about that. I can be thinking about much more strategic things by having that kind of artificial intelligence-enabled monitoring and alerting going on to kind of keep me on track. And as I progress through the process, not going to tell me how or who to award to, but it's going to make suggestions along the way. So we think of this a smart assist feature that's going to tell me at the outset of an engagement based on historical data patterns. So we're talking about machine learning technology here that can look at that and interpret that data, suggest to me what type of an event, an auction or an RFP might be most effective, or which suppliers should consider inviting. So it's not taking away from me the ultimate decisions around award and category strategy, but it's giving me the insights that the data can provide. And along the way, guiding the buying process. I'll talk a little bit more about that a little bit later on. But, having those kind of dashboard level views to monitor things, none of which we as humans can really keep on track of completely and simultaneously. What's going on with the supplier risk based on their performance trends? Get me information as an automated alert so that I can maximize the decision making. So again, I think the good news here is that innovative technologies are not stifling creativity, they're actually enabling more creativity, and they're not replacing the human element, they're actually maximizing and optimizing the value of human judgment. So back to you, Kelly. If we talk about more of our fears, in this case, loss of control.
Now that we've had some good news, we're gonna dip back in here to another fear. I think you've been giving sort of good news, bad news, Richard. I'll give some good news on this. Good news on this fear, the loss of control. If savings is our hardwired survival instinct focus, and standardization is very closely behind it in terms of being a part of the roots of why strategic procurement exists. Control, that fear, while it is very real, it is more perception-based than some of the others, right? Even though we talk about governance, we talk about compliance, we want to minimize risk, there is still a less tangible element to this. So this is actually a more inward fear. It has more to do with how procurement perceives the buying activity going on in enterprise. They do looking at the actual evidence of that work. So the source of this fear is that right down the end of that lovely, neat Chevron process flow, there was always a stage around on relationship management or governance and compliance, and positioned procurement as sort of like the spend police. We were the ones that as soon as the contract was signed and implementation was complete, a transition had taken place, you probably weren't going to hear from us unless you did something wrong. You bought the wrong thing from the wrong supplier, you bought it through the wrong channel. Then we found ourselves being in this command and control role, which had an awful lot to do with the reputation that has been developed internally, how other people see us. And positive response on our fear of losing control gives us an opportunity to think about and talk about the freedoms that we're trying to allow. And because this is a more internal fear, I think it's just as important procurement internally to discuss and think about the freedoms that we are trying to allow. It's not just about what are we trying to prevent, it's what are we trying to empower in the enterprise. Focusing on those and the benefits associated with them, but really containing the subset of things that are actually risky, right? Buying something critical from the wrong supplier, putting too large of a type of spend through a P card. You don't want waste, you don't want neglect around responsible spend decisions. So it's a matter of handling them and talking about them. From a negative perspective, this is actually similar to our loss of the fear around standardization, but comes with it the fact that, again, procurement may have sensed more of an ease in the organization. We may be more sensitive, our awareness is heightened than people are necessarily aware of. They're feeling relaxing, and it probably doesn't seem worrisome to them. Procurement, on the other hand, starts to relax a little bit, and then you almost snap to, oh my gosh, we're relaxing. We have to get back in control. And it's trying to turn us around, change the direction on that can be somewhat jarring to the people that we're working with on a regular basis. The advantage to overcoming this fear is actually being able to shift our role. So we don't just be command and control, although that's always going to be part of procurement, partly because we're the ones with access to the information and it's our mandate. That's what we feel responsible for. That's always going to be a part of our role. But if we can allow it to be less of our focus, it enables us to be more of an active participant. We're just standing back in referee mode, watching and ready to blow the whistle and throw the flag if we see someone do the wrong thing. We're actively playing in the game with participants from the other functions to move the ball forward. That's an enormous advantage. It's going to feel good to the people that we are supporting. It's going to feel good to procurement to do something different, do something a little bit more active. It gives us yet an opportunity to strike a balance between, yes, establishing some level of control, but also remembering that efficiency needs to be a focus as well. And Richard, I believe you're going to talk a little bit more about that.
Kelly, and striking this proper balance between control and efficiency as we look at the next slide here is nowhere, it is more prevalent in perhaps P2P than anywhere else that you'll find it if we go to the slide. And again, I'm going to use some data from the Hackett group here, and still waiting for the slide to appear. But essentially, they looked at the P2P process where the mantra has generally been "Thou shalt three-way match." Create this three-way match between the PO, the goods receipt, and the invoice. And the best practice data actually suggests that three-way match, while used by top performers on 34% of their line items and 44% of their total spend, is not always necessary. And the best practice really involves looking at your different spend categories and identifying those areas where a three-way match is not necessarily required. So if we look at the top swim lane, the three-way match as the maximum control, the one on the bottom is no man's land, that no one wants to be, where there's virtually no control when you got no PO, invoice only processes going on. But what Hackett has kind of said is everything in between. There may be some categories where a two-way match, for example, is all that's required and all that's warranted. It's therefore about determining those type of categories where an assumed receipt, just a PO and invoice match may be more appropriate. Low dollar spend categories like office supplies where maybe you don't really need that added control of a goods receipt. Or anyway, to receipt settlement, the PO match to the goods receipt, especially with highly integrated direct material or MRO suppliers, inventoried items, those kinds of things. And what this data says is top performers are able to actually process 42% of line items through these optimal channels that have that sort of just right level of the balance between control and efficiency from a process standpoint. Now, in order to implement a best practice like this, you really need to be able to configure workflows with a variety of business rules to identify which are those categories, what are the dollar amounts of spend, for example, or which business units or locations are we willing to live with, for example, a two-way match instead of a three-way match. So on the next slide, just kind of show you how that is now being enabled through the technology. When we think about workflows in the past, this meant a very laborious, so someone, certainly technical, someone from IT having to write a lot of code to implement and maintain complex approval workflows. Well, here you've got an on-screen drag and drop method of configuring with the drop-down boxes to plug in the various business rules. And so as a non-technical user, I could create category-specific workflows and the business rules to govern them to make that balance between efficiency and control, much more appropriate. So for the next slide, kind of continuing on this theme of, really let go where appropriate, relaxing some of the conditions. Here again, Hackett's data suggests that top performers are far more likely, more than 3 times as likely to be very effective at using their process and their technology to drive requisitions to the most appropriate buy-pay channel. So what are some of the best practices that account for this disparity? If you go to the next slide, I kind of want to show you how P2P technology has evolved to enable what we'll call guided buying. So this is, again, is going to make procurement more comfortable, relaxing some of the command and control type oversight if I can make sure that the technology is helping end users to make it easier for them to do the right thing. So guided buying, first of all, uses artificial intelligence to make sure that the users quickly find what they want, but that it's only from approved contracted vendors. So I'm steering users only to the right type of items that they're authorized to buy from the suppliers that have been identified as the preferred compliant to make. And at the end of the day, simplifying the checkout process for the end user as well, because artificial intelligence can determine based on my user profile and be able to default on my behalf the correct ship-to-bill information, GL, and commodity coding for the buying. So that's one of the reasons that procurement has been resistant in the past to give up control to end users, is they're going to get it all wrong in terms of what they buy, not only what they buy, but how it's coded, and then I don't get that an accurate spend date on the back end. So this notion of, again, artificial intelligence infusing a guided buying process can really drive that centralized buying activity to free up procurement, but be able to get over that fear of the loss of control. So again, back to you, Kelly. I think we're going to talk about a fear of the loss of procurement's role.
This is the big fear, right? This is, if we're working our way up in a progression from savings to standardization to control, the fear around the loss of our jobs is probably the most paralyzing of the fears. And it's no surprise. I mean, once again, the struggle is real with all of these discussions around things like AI-enabled guided buying, which is like you've talked about. We're sitting at our desks waiting for the trucks to roll up out front and offload our robot overlords, right? The more automated the process becomes, we all have this sense that whether it's physical robots or software robots, right, like robotic process automation, we're all thinking, you know, we're just 30 and a little bit of computer programming from being on the streets. How we respond to this concern about the territory that we've staked out and how we continue to play a role in managing that territory is going to determine, ironically, whether or not we're replaced by those robot overlords. So positive response is to say, okay, we can see that the need for us to invest our time and effort manually in these areas is starting to be eroded by technology. That's not a bad thing. You can't turn back the clock. As these things become possible and scalable and easy to implement throughout the enterprise, it is sacrificing the opportunity for competitive advantage not to leverage them, because someone else is going to leverage them. Instead, we need to look at, okay, what percentage of our time has been freed up? Let's make sure the automation is done right so that we do, in fact, get the proper coding that we need to be able to work in the future based on the spend data that's being created by buying activity today. And then let's look at what we can take on, opposed to starting to become defensive of our territory. I think two of the areas that are most damaging when someone in procurement takes this approach is when we start to hoard information, when we say, no, we're the only ones that can log into the systems and get this information. It's ridiculous. For the most part, all this information should be far more accessible to everybody in the enterprise that has a legitimate use for it. When procurement sets themselves up as a blocking gatekeeper, it's a self-defeating approach. And the same goes for access to suppliers. We try to act as a firewall in both directions, as a matter of fact, between suppliers and the enterprise and suppliers. We slow information, we slow down response time, we slow creation of good ideas. It is not an efficient way to make progress, and it's not an efficient way to realize maximum value from the contracts. The goal here, and this is where we actually go back to this idea of hitting a balance between standardization or control and creativity, is your imaginations to decide what the role of procurement should like going forward. Up to this point, evolution is something that we've driven. And I think we're finally reaching a point where both through the advancements in technology and also increased use of things like AI for even at-home B2C consumer buying that have changed people's technology expectations, evolution is starting to chase us a little bit. And while that's unlikely to change anytime soon, can be the ones to decide which direction we want to run in. And there are plenty of projects in any enterprise that would absolutely benefit from procurement's expertise. The goal is to be in control, if we can make ourselves feel better, be in control of where to spend our time, how does the transition take place, where do we invest in skills development or technology or people with a certain kind of experience, so that we are moving in a productive direction, one that is rewarding for us as well as beneficial to the enterprise. So it can be less concerned and less sad maybe, but like, oh, in the olden days, right? The good old days, how things used to be when we were the only ones that had any idea how much we spent on anything with anybody, to a more enlightened organization where everybody is more connected and empowered to take steps on their own and has access to information. And procurement is taking a much larger, more overarching kind of role because we're leveraging that distributed buying and those processes that we've rolled out as opposed to kind of having our fingers in everything just in order to move things forward. I think I only have a couple of minutes left, but I don't know if questions have come or if there are any last minute things that we should address while we still have a few minutes on the clock for this webinar. Oh, sorry, Richard. You have a final point. Apologize.
Well, that's okay, but I will go through it really quickly. And again, I think there's a good news scenario here is that there is a chance for procurement to redefine the role and in some respects rebrand procurement. So I'll just give a couple quick examples. One, I think, is to create a more customer-centric role for procurement, and there is a positive correlation between world-class type performers are much more likely to have this type of relationship, formal SLAs with internal customers. But relatively few organizations, only 20%, have either an explicit customer management organization or a formal customer management role. So if you go to the next slide, I want to introduce kind of an emerging technology capability that we have in our suite that really allows to become more customer-centric, providing end users what I'll call a portal to the procurement process. So the way request management works, first of all, there are lots of requests flowing over the transom to procurement today. It's just usually they are emails or phone calls, so a very sort of continuous kind of process. And this provides a little bit more rigor and structure. So a form-based process for an end user to request procurement involvement and then be able to have that flow seamlessly into the downstream use case. So I'm capturing information from a requester and figuring out he or she needs help conducting a sourcing event, negotiating a contract, onboarding a supplier, whatever it happens to be. So for the end user, they finally get visibility to what had been a black box process. For procurement, a way to more effectively triage this barrage of incoming requests and make sure that they're approved, that they're prioritized, they're working on the right things. So I'll share with you just a quick case study on the next slide. Then this comes from Porsche, Cars North America, that implemented this type of request management capability. And, first, to your earlier point, Kelly, wherever possible, they just made the systems accessible on a self-service basis. So you're a stakeholder, you need to view the supplier scorecard or find a contract. As long as you have permission based on your role, go ahead it yourself. But if you really need procurement's help with something, request management will manage that work queue on the part of the procurement professional may go through the kind of approval workflow, in this case a very sophisticated conditional approval workflow with upwards of 175 conditions, as many as 4 to 5 approvals. But now the requester has visibility to the status and disposition of the request. The folks have all the information they need to capture to then effectively manage those processes. And oh, by the way, in many cases, this has been applied to not only procurement but non-procurement type request management across the organization. So just one way, and I know we won't have time to get to all the examples, but just one way where procurement can sort of redefine that role, become much more customer-centric to the organization and more effective as a result. And if we go ahead to our last slide, I just wanted to show the actually last slide, highlight then, we really run out of time for Q&A. That's because we had so much great content to share, and I want to thank Kelly for help today. And I wanted to mention to everyone attending, number one, we'll follow up with an email to get you a copy of the slide deck, including some of the content we wouldn't have time to cover today. And so I wanted to make mention of some of this type of educational seminar and sharing best practices upcoming later this year, October 28th through the 30th. If you go to the last slide, the Horizon Conference this year to be held at the Lansdowne Resort in Leesburg, Virginia, where we'll tackle similar topics like your sourcing strategy by letting it go. And here's all the information. As I said, you'll get the slide deck, and encourage you to register in advance. I know there's some incentives for early bird registration and so on, or to learn more about the agenda for the conference. So, once again, Kelly, thanks so much for a great webinar. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And no, we didn't have time for the kind of Q&A that we anticipated today, but both Kelly and myself were glad to follow up via email with any of your questions. And please look for the email come from us with the slide deck and more information about the Horizon Conference. Thanks, everyone, for attending today's webinar.